Mr. City Manager, I will call this meeting to order regarding IPL future structure of governance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem and members of the council. I know the council, following the DKMT presentations, specifically on future governance of the utilities, wanted an opportunity to gather and discuss what that looks like and keep the conversation moving forward. So today, the formal presentation we have planned with Heather from DKMT is back to review the recommendations that she made as part of the initial summary that was given to council. And then Director of Independence Power and Light, Joe Hegendeffer, is also here to review the recommendations that he made, just so that the council gets a refresher and we're all working from the same common operating knowledge. So if it's okay with you, I'll go ahead and have Heather kick off the presentation. And then maybe we'll pause for questions for her and then transition to Joe, and then just take this conversation where the council wants.
Great setup. Thank you, Mr. City Manager.
Good morning, and thank y'all for inviting me back. This is a real pleasure, and I enjoy these conversations because, as you all know, the industry is changing dramatically. There's a lot of things happening, and so governance is one of the more important things that you can do right now, along with the investment in your system. Basically, we talked about three different structures when I was here before. You've got the council with the advisory committee, you've got the independent board, and you've got sort of a hybrid in between. You've got the one system where, like in the city of Seattle, the mayor, the general manager of the utility actually reports directly to the mayor, and the council is the board. And that's got pros and cons, as we've talked about. They had to actually form a somewhat large community-based committee in order to handle some of the detailed issues like strategic planning, rates, et cetera. So they have had to evolve as a result of council not being able to cover all those topics, especially for such a large utility. Then you've got the situation like Austin Energy down in Texas, where the council is the ultimate decider for most things, but they have a utility advisory board, and their job is to look at all the things that would come before council and make recommendations. They even give direction in cases like community outreach. We need to get more input on the resource plan, for example, which they were developing. And so what we call the EUC is responsible for making sure things like that happen. But when it comes to a rate change or even a major investment like in generation, whatever, they will make recommendations, and ultimately the council's the sitting board.
Heather?
Yes.
How is that different from what we have at the moment?
I think in my mind, the EUC has a lot more authority from the perspective of what they address, and the recommendations carry a lot of weight to council. But at the end of the day, they don't get to make a lot of decisions. But what's interesting too is they have very clear requirements to serve on the advisory board. They want an electric engineer. They want people with experience in the industry. They want technology. And so you have an advisory board of experts that can delve into the details, such that when council gets the recommendation, they know it's been vetted by some experts. And that's probably a little bit of the difference. The last model is CPS Energy, which has a totally independent board, and that's by bond ordinance. And they oversee everything. It's a mirror in a way of council, because the city of San Antonio is divided up into districts. And so it's a representative from each district on this board, and the mayor is actually on the board. So there's 5 votes. And they do everything from establish the strategic direction and planning. They approve capital investment. They approve the budget. The only thing that they don't have final approval of, but they make the recommendation that goes to council on rate changes, issuing debt, and condemnation, I believe, are the three things that have to be decided ultimately by council. But they rely very heavily on the board, and the board operates independently. They are their own governance structure.
Does that body hire and fire the CEO?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
They do. And in that case, which I think is the best practice, when they have a list of requirements, while they have to have representation from the 4 quadrants of the city, they also have to have expertise of some kind. Business is a huge one. They've got the military there. They've got academia there. They've got lots of large corporate entities. And so having a background in business, IT, areas like that, they have it specifically laid out in their application. And if you want to be on the board, you apply. The board interviews and selects the members, but that selection is a recommendation and council has to approve it. So council does have a final say based on the recommendations of the board. And so when I laid out the presentation on governance, it really was focused on those 3 models with the background of what a board is responsible for. And they're responsible for the well-being of the utility, fiscally and operationally. I mean, that's the number one job of any board or oversight board of the utility, ensuring that it has the resources and it's operated as intended, and that it's accountable, the utility is accountable to the community, so that you have regular financial statements, you have updates on the strategic plans, operations, things like that. That's where, in the big picture, we can talk a bit more about what that really looks like, but that's a huge responsibility, is to have ownership in the health of the utility and how it serves the community. And in public power, the other thing the board is expected to do, and this is my opinion, is to be the connection to the consumers, the customers, the community, and to reflect the priorities of the community. And so having mechanisms to allow for that is really important. A lot of boards will have, say, anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes before the business meeting starts to allow for community input. And so if there's hot issues, it may last longer than 10 minutes, but at least it gives the folks the chance to come in and voice their concerns and opinions to that board that can be taken into consideration and addressed during the meeting. Other than that, it's really just, I think the most important thing is deciding what it is you want out of your utility and how you as a board can facilitate that. The biggest challenge, I will say, with many boards is drawing that line, and we talked about this earlier, between getting into the details of the day-to-day versus being a board that oversees the strategic direction and monitors the performance. And that's sometimes the hardest thing for boards to do. That's also why some boards require at least some of the board members to have previous board experience, so you understand how to draw that line and not get too far into the weeds. What was brought up earlier too is most of the independent boards, well, all the independent boards hire and fire at least the general manager. Some do a little bit more than that. Like if you have an auditor that reports to the board, they hire and fire the auditor and the general counsel. Those are typically the 3 positions because they report directly to the board. The rest are decisions that are made internally. Any specific questions I haven't covered?
Heather? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So just to clarify, you talked about Austin Energy, Seattle, and SPS. SPS is not Springfield. Did I hear that right?
It's CPS Energy, San Antonio, Texas.
Okay, so we haven't in this group discussed the governance model in Springfield, Missouri. Is that correct?
Actually, we discussed it when I made the presentation.
Okay. Which one of these is closest to what Springfield does?
Springfield is an independent board for the most part. It's a very large board. It has very specific requirements of the folks that are on it. And so I would say it's closest to the independent model.
Thank you.
Question, do the majority of these boards have an independent, like, community advisory body that gets to take that, or do they primarily just have the 5 minutes of conversation at the beginning, 10 minutes of public testimony? Or it seems like it's probably all of the above. Some have someone on the council or on the utility board who represents community voice. So can you just tell me what your experience is?
Yes, and that's a great question. The way some boards get it is they have someone who actually represents the various aspects of the customer population. Like they may have someone that is an officer or high level management of one of the largest industries companies, say if you're an industrial city. Or if you have a university, someone from the university. Typically, there's someone that represents the underserved sector, either in volunteer services or something that knows about the needs of those groups. And so you'll see some of that in the requirements to be on the board. What happens a lot of times is, and you all probably are very familiar with this, if something is not going right, the community will voice their opinion. And then what the utility will do is, at the direction of the board, set up a process for gathering community input or going out and doing outreach, setting up a plan to do better communication, transparency. And two things can happen. Either, like in Seattle, they had enough issues that they had sort of a permanent board that was originally set up, I think, to review the strategic plan, and it then was merged with other subcommittees and is, in essence, a separate advisory board on strategy and rates and some other things. And their job, and it's a large board, and they take input and they represent the community. Or you can have an interim committee or subcommittee set up of the board and selected folks from the community to address specific problems. But a lot of times what I'm seeing now, especially in public power, is part of the strategic plan is how are we getting community input on major decisions, like your resource plan. You know, the community wants to know a lot about what you're doing to get power. And what are the sources and what's that going to cost? What are the options? So that's usually a big one. When there's been a natural disaster, whether it's floods or storms or whatever, they want to know what the utilities are doing to fix it so it doesn't happen again. And so you may have an interim committee do that. You may have a situation where, I just read about this in the paper, which nobody wants to happen to the utility, but there was an investigation into a major utility, public power, and they found a lot of bad things that employees were doing that were illegal, dangerous, involved drugs, alcohol on the job. And so there's been a whole separate entity formed to investigate. So you'll see things like that. That's not something you ever want to happen at your utility. It's something I used to see in the 80s. I haven't seen something like this in 40 years. So it's pretty interesting. And so a lot of it depends on how interested and active your community is. Sometimes it's real easy to put together these subcommittees or groups of special interest, especially if it's just for a fixed period of time, based on the fact you've got folks that are really vested in it. Sometimes it's not so easy, and that's where you really have to. The board says strategically, we want more transparency, and we want to know how you're communicating to all sectors. What is your strategy? How do they know about the services? And do they know anything about this utility and the good things it does for the community? And then it's delegated, as probably it should be, in partnership to the utility staff to then report to the board and tell them what they've accomplished, what they've done, and to get continual feedback on how it's working. And that's the accountability factor for boards.
I had a question. You mentioned the Springfield board was rather large. How many members does it actually have? Do you know?
Yeah, it's 11. I couldn't remember if it was 11 or 13, but
And how are they appointed?
I think they apply and then they are appointed, I believe, by their council. If I recall correctly. I haven't looked at their stuff in a few months.
Okay. So you're recommending 5 for if we did something?
I would recommend a manageable number between 5 and 8. 8 seems to be kind of the sweet spot. And especially if it depends on if you have some representation from council, which is always good to have on the board.
Okay. Well, this is more of a statement than a question, but I definitely think we need more than 5. I was thinking more like 7. I think 11 is probably too many, but I'll tell you what, 5, I just don't think that is a good representation of the city if we go with that few. And I'm also not you recommended one person outside, like lives outside of Independence as a business owner.
That was Joe's, and where that comes from, and that's actually not an unusual thing. I worked with a city in Colorado because they had some very large corporate entities who were some of the largest energy consumers that were based in the city and bought power, but their management or the people, the decision makers, did not live inside the city limits. They lived outside. But it was important to have representation of the industry, especially since they were the largest electric consumers on the board. And that's, for me, that's where that comes from. Plus, it's a very specific expertise. But Joe, you may have had a different thought there.
Well, and I mean, if we want to go into the recommendations that I had put forth in the study session, we can dig into those real quick and then take broader questions. So the 5 recommendation was purely from my observations. Seeing the PUAB was not staffed the majority of the time since I've been here. So it wasn't even fully assigned. And then once it was fully assigned, I would say that there's a great percentage, greater than 50% of the time, that we're struggling to even meet a quorum. So with the PUAB experience and then the recommendations and I would say presentations that our city manager has made on how hard it is to fill boards and commissions, I thought, let's pick a number where we know we're going to have a full board and we're going to be able to have attendance and we're going to be able to have active engagement. Again, these were purely recommendations for you guys to discuss. I'm not married to any of these. These were recommendations that I put forward for you guys to discuss, but that's how I landed on 5.
Okay, I completely get that. I mean, my thought would be this board is not, if not the most important, probably one of the most important. And we just had a charter committee and a geobond committee that were, in the double digits as far as members. So that's my only thought on that.
Understood.
Thank you.
What are the terms of these other boards? Are they all similar?
If I recall, Springfield had the shortest, I think it was 3 years. And they range anywhere from 3 to 6. So it's a very broad range depending. And some of them have term limitations. I think one of them, CPS Energy, has their terms are 5 years and you're limited to only 2 terms. So 10 years max.
Okay, thank you.
Heather, I have a question. My intent was to actually go back and review the study session, and time just got away from me. What has your experience been standing up a new board? And what are some of the things that we can avoid, some trip ups that we could avoid?
That's a really good question. one that I worked with, we spent a lot of time in community workshops defining what the representation of that board would be. But it was a community that was very, very active and had a clear vision of what they wanted out of their utility. And so they wanted representation from key customer sectors. It wasn't geographic, it was really and they wanted a specific business experience because they wanted people on the board that understood the industry, understood business, financial, just the various aspects that they felt like they wanted to see it run more business-like, but with the understanding that you are a public entity that's nonprofit and you're here to serve the community. So that's the first process. This is defining the qualifications and who you want to represent you. That takes a while. And then it's defining what that board is going to do. And that is another one that really involves the engagement of the council and the people in the community. And I would, you can have a subcommittee. You can do that any way you want to. After that, and you get all of those things laid out, you then decide when do you want to institute it, and the terms, when you've decided on the terms, my recommendation is to do staggered terms. So you may have one person that's only, say you have 3-year terms. And so you have 1/3 comes on for just a year, 1/3 for 2 years, and 1/3 for 3 years. And you make some accommodations for that, but that way your turnover isn't all at once. And that's a key piece of it. The hard part, and everybody stumbles because I've seen boards remake themselves, is trying to get the right people and the right balance of what the focus is. It's so easy to get distracted on things that are not significant because we all go towards what we know. And so that's where folks, boards sometimes get caught up in things that aren't as important as, say, $100 million purchase of generation. They'll spend more time on $50,000 purchases than they will the 100 million. And I think just people getting used to working together. But, you have to allow that's why I think 3-year terms may be a little short, because you have to allow for people to kind of, even if you've been in the business, get up to speed to how things work and working together. So those are the hard things in the initial part of it. But you just, you learn and you move on. One board I looked at, I can't remember which one, they do a self-review, I think every 2 to 3 years, where they have someone come facilitate the discussion about how they're doing and are they focused on the right things.
Heather, the other boards that you've worked with of this nature and the ones you've talked about this morning, do they just do power or do they do other utilities as well?
Springfield does all the utilities, as I recall. Most of them do just power, though, because water and electricity are two different things, very different things. A lot of people say, well, they're both infrastructure and they both have engineers and they provide services, but it's very different. I worked for a utility that did water and power, and our board oversaw both, but it was a board that was appointed by the governor. And what they did is they formed basically kind of sub-boards of those board members to deal with the issues, say, of water or of generation or of transmission, because it was just too much. And even down to salaries and compensation and what things cost and the permitting. There's just a lot of difference between the two. Regulation is a big one.
So to me, that's one of the questions we have to address is, are we just going to talk about IPL? Are we going to do all the utilities? How are we going to structure the leadership elements? Because right now they're different departments. And so they have different, leaders. And so, if we grouped it all under a public utility, board, then, do you have one director for the whole thing? Do you have, multiple? I mean, I think that's questions we got to address and deal with.
And that's a good question. If you look at it without knowing either business, it's really easy to say from a logical perspective, let's centralize utilities or utilities. But I would suggest talking to Springfield, since they do both, as I recall, what are their challenges? And that may be why their board's so big, quite honestly. It's a lot.
I had one more question, actually more of a comment and then a question. So I want to go back to the staggering of the terms. I think all of us kind of want to just take the politics out of this board. So is that kind of the thought process of staggering terms? Basically, if you do 3 or 5 years, sometimes board members may go longer than the city council is elected for certain members.
That's part of it. Yes, absolutely. And to take the politics out of it, which you can't do 100%, but you can do a lot. What I've seen is kind of like CPS Energy does. The board actually interviews and makes recommendations of who they think should be on the board based on what they know the board needs, and then council approves it. While council is elected, there's some independence in that process, and it's an open application process with specific requirements. The other thing that Springfield Utilities does, which I think is excellent, and you see it in some of them, are their conflict of interest and ethical standards. You cannot, run for office while you're on the board. There's certain things you can and can't do within a year after you leave the board. They're pretty strict, and they limit the number of folks from any single party at one time to 6 to keep it, even. So there are a lot of structural things you can put in place, which I think are extremely important. A code of conduct is huge for boards, and you see it now for almost every board, and what they can and can't do, relationships they can and can't have, and associations and political activities are pretty clear, and that helps. But the staggered terms starting out especially is one of those things.
So I've served on more than my share of boards. I always end up on the bylaws and governments section because the rules and the structure and the code of conduct really are the bread and butter for a successful board, but so is orientation and training, but also previous experience. So this is not a starter board. And I have been on starter boards, and I have been on sort of evolved boards. I don't know what you would call it, but there is sort of a baseline understanding. We are a policy-making entity. We are not an operating board. How do you balance that with a brand new board? I think almost the expectations for an inaugural board are higher than at any time in its future. When I sat on the Healthcare Foundation, when we first had a board, the governor set up a review process with lawyers, et cetera, so that first board set the tenor and the set of behavior and expectations for future boards. Probably one of the best processes I've ever seen. Just curious about your advice for us.
You are right. That first board will set the kind of the standard of how future boards will behave and operate. And so you don't want it to be sloppy. You want things to be very tight and expectations very tight. And as they operate and gain some experience, there'll be adjustments made. But I think you start with maybe a little bit, as you said, higher expectations of how things are going to go, and then adjust from there. So the way you described that hospital board is exactly, it's a good model on how to take it from there. Having everything laid out in writing as much as possible. You can't anticipate everything, but you don't want too much judgment or flexibility or questions, gray areas, I'll put it that way. It just, it will cause conflict, and you don't want conflict over small things. You want disagreement. You want professional disagreement, especially on boards. That's why you want different skill sets and different backgrounds, because that's part of the board being a high functioning board. But you don't want disagreements over ethical, legal, bylaw type issues. You want to get that. And that's why a lot of times people have the city attorney sit in, maybe not a voting member, but have the city attorney sit in to, resolve any issues that might be of question like that.
So my next question is, one of the things you're going to want on this board is people who come with an accounting, finance, business, loan, structured debt, people who really understand pieces like that to be able to help, because one of the things we're going to have to do are make large investments. We're going to have to use bond counsel. We're going to have to take out debt. We're going to have to structure debt. So you need the sophistication of people who come with that business and finance background. However, we talked about, potentially having some big industrial user. How do you balance their incredible skill set that comes with that, because they're doing structured debt, with their inherent conflict of interest of being one of your major utilizers? So how do you manage the conflict of interest? Do they give their input and then recuse themselves? Are they, because they have a fiduciary responsibility to the board, do they just accept that fiduciary responsibility and act as an independent member when they're there, independent of their business? So I'll leave that to you.
If you have someone who represents the capital markets on your board, you want their advice. But if you're voting on a bond deal that might involve their business, well, they'd have to eliminate their company from any part of the business, number one. And that's how you deal with that sort of thing, especially if it's relating to the sale of bonds. When you have a large industrial customer who comes on with the business hat on, there really is an inherent conflict of interest, because their business is not supplying anything to the utility. What they're doing is giving their perspective as a customer, what makes sense and what doesn't, which if they have a strong business background, that's what you want. The one thing you run into, and this is why you need people that understand the government or nonprofit world, is, and I'm on a utility board, just for full disclosure, but it's a corporate board, and that's a very different animal. Sometimes corporate entities have a hard time understanding the difference, because the focus is, well, we got to do the cheapest thing we can do. And if, the customer, while they're important, if it saves them money, they may not want to think about the customer. And so having that good business sense, but also having someone that represents the customer need, is really an important balance. And that's how you help offset that. You make sure in your bylaws to define conflict of interest. And typically it really is if you are doing business or involved in decisions with contracts with the utility, things like that.
So I'm going to give a hypothetical. Understanding we wouldn't want the maker of transformers to be on the board, and then we bought transformers from them. Okay, that part I understand. Where I have a little more gray area is say I'm on the board and we are making a rate structure for large industry, medium industry, and small industry, I clearly have an interest in that. Yet I also have an expertise that you need in the conversation. How do you untie that Gordian's knot? Because that's a tough one for me.
That person's one vote, one voice. That's why you have someone that represents the other customer sectors. And that's why you have a staff that you direct to make sure they have, one, done a cost of service analysis and identified who drives the cost. The other is that you have, if you don't have those people on the board, you have a process where the recommended rates are taken out to the public and gotten input on. And what you calculate the impact on everybody. Anytime you do a rate change, you look at each rate class and say, okay, it's going to affect residential rates, $2 a month, or 3% or whatever. But you make sure that analysis is done for each rate class, and there is a presentation to the public where you can get input. The thing that's important is getting that input, and that industrial customer, like I said, is one voice. But you have, say, 4 or 5 other voices on there that hopefully represent the other aspects of your community.
Is that also possibly why some of the, or at least in part, why maybe the council would retain final rate approval? Would that impact that, or?
I think so, because ultimately, at the end of the day, council is elected by the public and theoretically represents the public. What you hear, and that's why having, say, a major customer or on your board, whether it's a university or industrial or hospital or school, whatever, is a lot of those customers feel like they have no place to voice their concern. And you won't see those folks at city council. I mean, they don't have time for that. And so you'll see them, though, participate in a specific forum like a utility board where they feel like their voices can be heard and they can have an impact.
Mr. City Manager, when was the last time we had that rate structure? Wasn't that fairly recent?
Yeah, there was studies done several times, but wasn't it 18 that we went to the complete new structure that was approved by city council and everybody went to those rates?
Is that shelf life still good with those? Do you believe?
I would say no.
I would say no.
Yeah, okay. So a new one would be probably in order as we're beginning to stand up a new board.
So with my new finance manager, we're updating the finance model for IPL and we'll do an updated cost of service study as well to make sure those match up.
And on the water and wastewater side, we're currently in the process of a cost of service study for the sanitary utility. And we'll start one, we're trying to get one started this fiscal year for water utility. The last time sanitary sewer rates were adjusted was in 20. And I believe water has been more than a decade. And just point of clarification to hop back to an earlier question, Springfield does not have sanitary. That's part of environmental services. That is just part of city government. And as opposed to the Public Service Commission that would have all of the utilities that are privately owned. So just for comparison.
So I'm willing to ask, what are the biggest mistakes that you see when in different utilities, either in setting them up or in their governance structure? Where do you see them hit bumpers?
No board's perfect. I mean, it's people. And so something I mentioned earlier, getting caught up in minutia and missing the big picture, spending hours arguing over, I saw this a couple of months ago and I just kind of made me cringe, but had a board, very well functioning board, and they got caught up on delegation of authority. And this is a $1 billion utility, trying to decide whether to go from, 10,000 to 50,000 delegation of authority. I don't think they buy anything for 50,000 or under, quite honestly. And they spent hours debating it and saying, oh, well, we have to see this. And the utility says, well, we can bring it to you in a report. But your PO list is, this long and is, do you want to be approving office supplies? Those are the things that you see. And again, I think it's what people know and what they're comfortable with, getting caught up in that sort of stuff versus the strategic issue of, we just bought 3 new power plants. How are they functioning? I mean, and literally that was in the same meeting. So it's not good or bad. Everybody gets caught up in it. But trying to manage that process is where boards and again, boards not looking forward. It's real easy to manage today because you don't know what you don't know. And I think a board's highest function is their strategic vision and where they want that utility to go. And if you don't have that, that's where you start. Both the operations and the board start having a lot of problems because you're not looking at, a lot of times it's scary, when you're looking at the fact that the cost of materials may be going up anywhere from 10 to 100% right now. What's the strategy for managing that? Managing your risk. The fact that do you have a strategy? Do you want to grow your load? Do you want to have industrial customers? So how do you work towards that? That is where the boards, to me, that's not doing that work and then saying, okay, utility, come to me with your plan and then hold them to that plan. That's where things really, I think, everybody gets frustrated and the community's unhappy, the board's unhappy, and the utility ceases to function.
So, Mr. City Manager, as we're conversating here, what are the action steps that we need to formulate and come together on to move forward?
I think prior to the meeting, I had asked, for any specific questions that council members had, and I appreciate the feedback that we received. Prior to the meeting, we tried to go ahead and summarize some of those questions up there. I recognize that may be difficult for people who are watching this meeting, so I'm going to read those to you, but these are some of the key considerations I think this body needs to start to coalesce around. The total number of board members that would serve on this entity, their terms, how they would be removed if necessary, and then any kind of formal training related to the board. I'm going to jump down, but those skill sets, are there specifically adopted? Councilmember McCandless mentioned accounting backgrounds. Are there specific skill sets or attributes that you're trying to fulfill? I would use the newly established Convention and Visitors Bureau as an example. We've tried to create a variety of perspectives and viewpoints on that. And so, are there groups or professions or industries that you are trying to have represented on this board? Who do the directors report to? Is that still up through the city manager? Do they report to this board? Do they report to the council? We didn't specifically write this, but I think you're also going to need to decide which utilities are impacted by whatever decision is made. What are the powers of the city council versus the powers of the board? So ability to enter into contracts, ability to approve budgets, ability to set rates, ability to manage employees. What does all that look like? And then all of this really coalesces around the city charter. Right now, our form of government envisions a model, obviously, with these utilities, the directors of which are appointed by the manager of who, of course, is accountable to the city council. There is a public utility advisory board with certain powers, duties, and responsibilities, but then obviously language that sets certain powers, duties, and responsibilities relative to the council. I will inject just a bit of personal opinion here and say, part of this was the work of the recently concluded City Charter Review Committee, because there have been various interpretations over the years of what's the responsibility of the Utility Advisory Board versus the council. Some of those amendments that were brought forward in the proposed charter change were intended to clarify and add additional language and context to roles of the council versus roles of the Utility Advisory Board. But you're going to want to decide, what is this entity going to look like? Have that reflected in a proposed charter amendment, and then, of course, decide when you would want to bring that forward to the community. So recognizing I just hit you with a fire hose there, that's sort of the big topics that the body will want to start deliberations about.
Heather, would it be your recommendation as we tackle those questions, go to the community and workshop this and have that conversation to tweak that more?
I would, but my bias is public input. When you're a public entity, especially government, the more you can encourage your community to help define this, the more ownership they'll have. And I think it goes a long ways to develop understanding and probably future board members.
Well, I seem to be in the agreement as Councilman Stewart. There definitely more than 5. 7 seems to be a good number. I would even entertain 9, but certainly 7.
Well, I'll just go ahead and give my opinion on what I think we need. I think we need 7 basically people that are residents, and I would not have an objection going to 9 if we included some business owners. But obviously that we can discuss that. But 7 definitely need to be residents, in my opinion. And I don't think a city council member should sit on it.
If we have this body, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's hybrid, I am assuming that this body is in charge of budget and basic policies. Things that would come back to the council would just be issuing debt and setting rates on recommendation from this body. I agree with Bryce in that I do not think a council member should sit on this, because then they get 2 bites at the apple. I do think the way that we have it, where we have a council member assigned to the committee, but not a voting member. I actually feel like the 7 people, we should have 2 seats that could be a business owner, a landowner, or a resident, because those are all constituents, whether they live here or not. Otherwise, it's so weighted toward the residential ratepayer, we forget about the other types of important ratepayers. I have seen ones where they actually have someone who does not have connection to the city, so that they have a truly independent voice on their boards or commissions. I don't think that would fly in Independence, but you'd be able to have someone from the Columbia utility or from the Springfield utility who brings utility background with a very different perspective to inform you, but they don't have a dog in the hunt. So their perspectives are kind of clean from the city politics. I don't know that my colleagues would fall for that, so I just put that out there as a maybe. I do think that you want terms that are at least 3 years, with the possibility of 2 extensions if they are voted in. 9 years seems like a good amount of time for you to both be expert and committed to the process. Maybe up to 12 years, but boy, after that, you get pretty darn stale on your board. And it's important to have some of that turnover. I think a fierce conflict of interest and code of conduct is like the thing that you, before you even get to community meetings, you need that piece lined out, because people need to understand that your duty is the fiduciary duty to the board, regardless of your other responsibilities. I do feel strongly that community input's going to be a great place, and I think you will surface some fantastic potential board members. I love the idea of an open process where anybody can self-nominate, but then you're going to need a process for selecting that first board. Is that done in conjunction with the PUAB? Is that done by the council? Is that done in partnership with the utility? So I think we still have those questions to answer. Thank you.
So I'll add a little bit in that from my perspective. So, you know, I agree that 5 is too small of a number. I'm more inclined to a 7 to 9 number. And, you know, in either of those cases, I would want at least 1 and maybe 2 potential people from outside the community, if they bring certain, you know, expertises that we can't seem to find within the community. That would be, I think, important for us to do. The question of the term, I think 3 is a little short, personally. I mean, but 4 might be better. I'm just thinking out loud. But that's, you know, I'm open for that discussion. I'm more interested in the discussion relative to, I think what I've kind of heard a little bit about is that, you know, we as a council, we retain rate decisions, and yet we would rely heavily on that board to make recommendation. The same thing with debt issuance. The one question that is, I think, you know, that we may need to have some discussion on is the budget question. And the question being is, does the council retain that budgetary approval, you know, with a strong recommendation from the board? That would be, you know, kind of a question in my mind. Certainly, I agree with the concept of having things laid out, and that's probably where we need to spend, I think, our time on what we think, so that we can then take our thoughts, our initial thoughts at least, to the public in some sessions to get input. But I think we need to have a framework of what we think before we go to them. We just don't want to go out there and say, what do y'all think? I mean, you know, that's too wide open. So I think we need to do that. I like the idea that the board does the interviews and makes recommendations to the council for what they think they need on that board. That makes a lot of sense to me. I do think we need to identify the areas of expertise that we need. I like the idea of staggered terms. Depending on how long the term is, I certainly think we stagger them at different points, especially initially. And so those are just kind of some initial reactions and thoughts.
I may just add, for the council's benefit, to Councilmember Fear's point, it appears, using Springfield just as the example, that utility board, submits a budget to the city council. That is then there's some parameters on what the council can do relative to amending the submitted budget. but it is sent to the council for approval as part of the overall annual budget process.
And do they then work to the budget? Once the budget's approved, they don't have to bring back to the council, well, this is how much polls cost, and this is how much they are able to, they're authorized for the expenditures as long as it's within budget. Is that?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Do we know that the Springfield board is then in charge of the strategic plan and the long-term generation planning? Does that have to come back to the council for approval, or that's an internal process?
It appears to me that that is not an item that is defined in the charter in Springfield. It specifically references the board member, the board composition, the terms, the appointment process, which those are appointed by the city council, and then the budget and expense process. But I'm not seeing anything relative to short and long-term strategic planning.
I think in one of the things I read in their minutes, that they do set the vision and work on the strategic planning. What I didn't see, to your point, Zach, was how they report back to the council on that.
Heather, is there any recommendation on the skill set that we should look for?
Yes. And again, you know your community better than I do. There's two things to balance. And I talked about this a little bit. The type of people in your community, your customers and constituents, making sure those segments are represented, but also strong business, accounting, finance, legal helps. But if you can have a city attorney that sits there as just an advisor to help on a lot of things, because you will encounter questions about legally, and especially as you start off in your bylaws, can we do this? Can we not do this? I have a list or an example of an application from one of the boards, and they go through economics, let's see what some accounting, corporate business, economics, energy and government, information technology. That's a big one these days. Legal, marketing, real estate, financial expertise is probably one of the big ones, because the ability to understand financial reporting, financing options, commercial transactions, governance experience, both corporate or nonprofit. And depending on your community, it could be military or community leadership, public policy background, communications. So it's, again, there's a list. It's kind of almost looks like a job description, which is good. It's very helpful, because when you apply, you've got to at least be able to check some of these boxes. But you also have to look back at balancing that with the different folks in your community, which you can get both. I mean, you can get someone from your residential sector that maybe works for a nonprofit that supports one of the biggest organizations that supports the underserved. I mean, you could get all of those in one person. You could get your corporate or board or business acumen from one of your large industrial customers. Your school districts, if you have a leader from your school district, they understand public governance because they deal with the school board. So those are some examples.
Our city is one of the unique ones, certainly with Springfield, where our power base is heavily relied upon by our residents as opposed to commercial and certainly industry. So there's that upside downness to that. And I believe the independent school district is the largest power user that we have. Who's our second off the top of our head here?
I believe that's Unilever.
Unilever.
Did I clarify, follow up to Councilmember McCandless's question? I did find some additional language in the Springfield Charter relative to their utility. So that board is empowered to hire persons to operate the utility. They are empowered to purchase operating supplies and equipment. They are empowered to provide for the extension and improvement of property, to enter into contracts with other public and private utilities, and fairly broad, to do all things needful for the successful operation of said utilities.
I'm wondering about, you said one of the criteria might be energy experience or something to that nature. And yet we hire that energy experience inside the organization. So I guess I'm trying to understand how important that is when you hire that and pay for that.
Well, obviously, hiring it is the most important thing you can do because you want the person running your utility to be an expert. What helps having on the board is someone who, and I see this sometimes, a former executive, say, of a utility being on a utility board. That was my background. That's why I was put on the board I'm on, is someone that has that kind of big picture view and understands what's happening in the industry, so that, say, your general manager brings an idea to the board about expanding the transmission system, and it doesn't quite make sense. You might have someone on the board that has the understanding of strategically why you would do it or why you wouldn't, or understanding the regulatory parameters in which you can do that. So it's not necessarily, I know one board likes to have an engineer, but it's an advisory board that gets more into the details of things. I would recommend it from the perspective of someone that is seeing the big picture of what's happening, so they understand what may be important versus not. It just helps. Having been someone that's reported to a lot of boards and been on boards, it just helps having someone that is familiar with what's happening in the industry and the challenges. Because one of the things boards need to do more of, I will say that they're not doing now, is risk management and looking at the risk facing the utility. And that's where someone perhaps with that background can, things from cybersecurity, but again, the changing rules on procurement, the fact that in the utility industry, the most critical pieces of equipment come from overseas. What's your strategy and how you're going to address that? The growth where I live, they're predicting a doubling of the demand today in the next 15 years due to data centers and all the things that are out there. So it's just helpful. And if, the other side of it is you can always hire that expertise. And you assume that's what your utility manager brings to the table, but sometimes it's also helpful to have someone to prompt the questions.
So this board, as I'm kind of thinking out loud, we're in a unique, I think a great spot, really, being that we have greenfield development that is beginning to take place, and certainly in the future, then redevelopment with our old parts of town, maybe help define what that vision is going to look like and how can we get to those next steps. As much as we try to educate and inform, I don't know a lot of our residential ratepayers fully appreciate how upside down we are with that production and how those rates do flow up or down depending on the big users that we do have or do not have. So the board is going to have a lot of work cut out for them to set the pace for the future.
Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, can you hear me?
Yes, Councilwoman Wiley.
Thank you. So to add to the discussion, we've talked a lot about Springfield, and it's my understanding that their board is a utility board. So I think a discussion about, I assume our board, we're just talking about IPL governance. And then secondly, a discussion about our PUAB and where they fit into this discussion.
That's a good point. Are you wanting to carry the discussion further? Any thoughts?
I think that I was kind of thinking the same direction that Heather was relative to that in regards to, I think I would be helped to understand where the council's currently thinking or feeling relative, whether it's IPL only versus all the utilities or some combination thereof. I think that would be helpful to understand, to help frame our discussion going forward. I'm inclined, maybe a question, Mr. City Manager, can you just budgetarily, what are the budgets of our three utilities, just the broad budget? And I think I know roughly what IPL is, but I'm not sure that I could just say off the top of my head what the other two are.
Yeah, 36 million in our sanitary sewer and about 40 million in our water utility. Joe, you're about 130? About 155.
Yeah, so substantially more on IPL, and we know that as we see, requests come through, we know the cost there. And so I guess I would be helped by a little more discussion about that, just to see, just curious as to where the council is feeling on that.
So are you anticipating that you would leave a remnant of the PUAB to do water and sewer and spin off IPL as its own separate board?
Well, that's certainly one option. I mean, I thought about that, as an option. And yet, maybe if we think the best thing to do is to do all three of them, then maybe we do all three of them. I'm not sure we think that yet. But that's why I'm trying to understand what everybody's thoughts are.
And could it be that the renamed PUAB is a subsidiary of the big board looking at those things and then rolling up so that the same sorts of processes apply? You have a budget, you have budget approval, you have expenditures, you have policy and long-term planning that happen because the two are distinct in their needs, but you have one big board who approves that. So it's just, I think, perhaps a different model, but I think one that bears discussion. I have a question for the city manager. Because, perhaps a clarification, does this require a charter change in order to make these things happen? How much time? When would we have to have that approved? When would it go on a ballot?
There's a couple things that I'm sensing and that we would need to sort through. We need to decide, first of all, are we just impacting the one utility, the electric utility, with this decision, or would all three? Right now, the charter specifically only references the electric utility because that was the only utility that existed at the time of the charter's adoption. Now it provides for, other such utilities that come to be adopted, and then those all flow under the Utility Advisory Board model that's in place today. So we would need to decide what's being impacted. And I don't have the answer for this. This is the council's to toss about, but ask yourself, what is it you're trying to improve upon, or the gain that you're trying to get? And I think that will help the council get to the answers of which utilities do you want to have addressed in this. Because of the current model in which the departments are segregated and there's a director that's hired by the city manager, that's one thing that's going to need to change potentially, is, having the personnel responsibility shifted to this board. The creation of the board, of course, is a second thing that's going to need to happen. And then all of the powers and duties and terms that are outlined, for example, in the Springfield Charter, which I'd be happy to email a copy of that to all of you, just so you can kind of see what that looks like in black and white. As I recall, we are required to call for an election 90 days prior to, give or take, prior to the date of the next election to be held. So relatively soon, here by the end of May, is when you would be calling for a fall election, the August cycle specifically. And then I believe into July for the November cycle, somewhere in there. So you'd be coming up pretty fast to do something in 2025. And of course, you'll want to be mindful of, 26, you've got citywide council elections. You've got primaries and general elections for our legislative delegation in Missouri. So finding the time that you think is appropriate are those issues you would need to tease out. Is that begin to answer some of your questions, council member? Okay, good.
I did a little research through the city clerk on our cost to do an election. And of course, it all depends on what other entities have anything on the ballot. But if we are the only thing on the ballot, then the cost to that election is roughly $250,000. And so that's, that's a substantial sum. And so we may want to try to do it when we can share that cost with other entities.
To piggyback a little bit off Councilman Fierce, I think just looking at IPL, the electrical part of the utility would be my thought for the board, given the complexity, the budget, just all of the minutia that goes along with that. As council members being on the council, you have now fully realized how much time and energy goes into just the decisions that we make and the processes thereof. And using perhaps what you were talking about, Councilwoman McCandless, with the PUAB looking and working with the other two. But the main focus being with the electrical rate structure. I'm in no hurry to move this onto a ballot. I'd rather have a good, thoughtful work product, community discussion. So I would almost say 25 is probably out of the question. To really get our thoughts concise and certainly be able to have that public engagement to get that feedback and digest that feedback. But you're right, we have to be very conscious of what other items are going to be on the ballot. I mean, heavens knows we're still waiting for the Jackson County to figure out what they want to do with the stadium. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there, but I want to make sure that our work product and our thoughts are on point. So I'd like to get it done as soon as possible, but certainly not pushing a time agenda.
So our choices are August, November, February, and April. So February is maybe that 7-month, maybe the appropriate time. Can we not do it in February?
Hi, I don't have the statute in front of me, but there are only specific types of elections that are allowed in February, and I don't think this would qualify. So I can get a firm answer for you here in a minute, but my off the cuff answer is no, I don't believe February would be an option for this.
So that moves us to an April timeframe where we have, other elections, which the good thing is we're going to have that April election regardless. So we could spread the cost and do it all there. The negative side is it might be a distraction to some degree as well. So, or that actually could be a positive too, I suppose, could go either way. I think our challenge is for us to kind of decide what we think is our best practices, best practice and best structure, among ourselves, and then go out and get that input, from the public and see yeah, they agree or no, they don't agree, and why, and, give some opportunity for that input. And there may be things we can kind of decide on. There may be some things that we're more mushy on, and we want to get more input before we actually um, reach a conclusion among ourselves. I'm not sure, but
What about a trip to Springfield?
yeah, I thought about that as well. When I was at the APPA with Joe, I visited quite a bit with the folks in Springfield, and I think that might be helpful to us. I mean, I think we'd have to be. I'm not sure how we would do that relative to the number of people, but or if we could do it with the number of people, but uh, I think thought being is that I think that would be helpful to understand better and ask some hard questions of that group and kind of get a better take on that. I think that would be helpful to me at least, especially I think around the question of just IPL versus all the utilities. That's probably and the other piece of the thing that I really want to structure with them. What do they see as their pros and the cons of the different what powers the board has versus what powers the council has, terms, some things of that nature. I think I would just like to hear their pros and cons on those. So I think that would be helpful. And it may be just that a contingent of us could go down there and then come back. But that's just a thought.
Can I hop in real quick? One of the longstanding issues with just comparing the three utilities, and this might come in when we're talking about one or all, if we separate them further and have the board only have IPL, we've had a longstanding issue with pay discrepancy for IPL versus the rest of the city. If you do have that separation and you've got a board managing that budget and that salary structure and hiring decisions, that may help with that discrepancy from a citywide perspective. Just food for thought.
Good point.
And Heather, you said that Springfield is all utilities. It's not.
Wastewater is separate in
Okay.
Springfield. It's part of environmental services.
Oh, you said that.
But in Springfield, they also have trash, I think, and transportation. So that's which, we hadn't even talked about either one of those kind of things. So.
Yeah.
To keep the conversation going, and certainly within our minds and with this body, should we meet again in 30 days, 45 days? I guess, Mr. City Manager, try to set up a tour of Springfield. And in the meantime, we'll be digesting here and definitely following up in other conversations, one-on-one conversations and the like in our research. Do we want to shoot for the middle or the end of May, first part of June? Any thoughts or pleasures on that?
I think that would be good. And I think, if we could maybe shoot for the end of May would be best for summer things get rolling. And I'm looking at Joe over here who's.
Well, my thought was maybe we look at when they have board meetings, and maybe it might be good to attend a board meeting. That way you guys could see how they conduct their board as well.
Yeah, I was actually wondering about that. We could
I can get those dates for you.
could attend a board meeting and maybe meet with people before or after that meeting, to kind of ask some of the questions that we might have. So I think that would be helpful.
I'm going to throw in another, not probably in lieu of, but maybe something that could be scheduled sooner than later if you're interested. So a former boss of mine is now the general counsel at Springfield Utilities. And so I know, he'd be willing, if you wanted to have a Zoom meeting or something like that, to have if you have initial questions, maybe either, like I said, in preparation for or in advance of even a follow-up, visit down there or something like that. So we could, if that's something you're interested in, we could definitely arrange that just to kind of have, again, the more information we can get you all, the better. So if you're interested in that, we can arrange that as well.
Another question before we tie up here, and it just occurred to me, Heather, and I'm not trying to put Mr. Gregor on the hot seat over there, but how do you work with the IBEW and other union groups within a structure like this? to help keep everybody with open doors and communication going.
That usually is handled within the utility itself.
Okay.
Unless what will come to the board will be union contracts. You know, when there's especially if it affects benefits and that sort of thing. But that is where the union negotiators and HR folks, they all work with the unions within the utility. Now, it's not to say that the union can't go to the board and air a grievance or bring up an issue. But what you see coming to the board will be contract updates, changes in any of the terms, things like that, that you would expect the board to have to approve.
So there really wouldn't be that much difference of a change compared to how we activate and work with them now.
That's up to you all.
Sure.
If you have a very strong union-based community, you may want to have them involved more than just having approval of a negotiated contract, because the contract, theoretically, it represents both sides. But if you know you're hearing it from the city or the utility staff, and so I think it really depends on the community. I believe, I recall in Seattle, I believe they have union representatives on their advisory board because they have a very strong pro-union city.
Just another thought of as we're putting stuff in the hopper.
Yeah.
That's a
I
good question.
have a question about Springfield in that we wouldn't just be hybrid from the board and oversight committee. We're also hybrid in that we have shared services. So is the Springfield utility, they have their own HR, their own finance, their own communications, their own audit. I mean, we have our own audit, but I'm just like, we have blended services. Now he has to pay for everything he uses. He has to purchase those units of service from the city, but I'm just, that's perhaps a difference between us and Springfield that we would have to think about.
Most definitely. I will say that is a common issue with every city-owned utility. What functions are within the utility and what functions are shared services? On some level, because you are part of the city, you have shared services of some form or fashion. But I've seen utilities have their own HR for the reasons that you talked about, and that you're dealing with different compensation structures. And if you're dealing with a union, then that brings in another, dynamic. Or and I've also seen centralized if the benefits retirement functions are the same for everybody. So you will see that as a shared service. I have seen finance both ways. And it depends on the entity. If the utility is its own credit, a lot of times the financial staff will be based in the utility. If it is a city credit, then that will be more centralized function. Things like shared IT systems, your enterprise accounting system, GIS if it's enterprise, sometimes the HR systems, part of IT, would be centralized. There's always a conflict in that perspective, and that the utility is high demand on technology. And I hear from some utility managers, it's hard to get their issues prioritized with all the other city stuff. So all of those things can be looked at. But because you are part of a city, there'll always be some shared services, and it's not necessarily a conflict. It's where you set up contracts and agreements, and you establish a budget at the beginning of the year and a service level and operate on that. And if it doesn't work, you renegotiate. But it really depends on where the utility can get what they need when they need it, and whether there's cost efficiency or operational efficiency. The other thing I didn't mention that happens, and then it's again a common thing, but I've seen where having a board that is that does work closely with the city, where you have more alignment, especially sometimes if they're independent. And and it doesn't matter whether they're independent or just an advisory board, but being able to coordinate with other boards in the city, for example, your planning commission, your public works, those, if you can coordinate and have some way of your planning process communicating with each other, because anytime the utility is doing a major capital project, it's going to affect the roads, it's going to affect the right of ways, potentially other aspects of infrastructure, and vice versa. And if your planning is done together, and especially like you're going to redevelop a whole area of Independence, this is a big deal. Your planning commission is going to be involved. Your public works are going to be involved. All of those entities, those commissions somehow need to coordinate and maybe have a multi-level approval process where, and this is bureaucratic, but it ensures people are talking, that it has to go to all three entities to get approval so everybody knows their role in it, versus it being a surprise. Oh, wait a minute, you mean I've got to run electric conduit underground at this area next year? So those are things also to think about in the city dynamic, and that's really important as you think about how your board works within the city.
I have one other thought, and I'm not sure, Joe, you can weigh in on this. As we're talking about other sources of information for us, is there any benefit to meeting with MPUA or getting any input from them in terms of, I mean, they see this throughout the whole state, and just kind of curious if that would be helpful, or maybe that's not really the area of expertise we need. I'm not sure.
So I'm never going to say no to reaching out to MPUA. I mean, they've got a wealth of knowledge and a good central group of people who have dealt with different sized cities. I guess thinking about the number of cities in Missouri who report to a utility board versus the council city manager style that we have set up, it might be beneficial to talk to them, and maybe more beneficial to reach out to some of the other cities who different sizes that report to utility boards. So Carthage, Nixa, some of these other size cities that have a utility board. And I can absolutely set up any of those meetings, and maybe those might be more beneficial via a Zoom call or something rather than a visit, but maybe another city that has a board might be more beneficial to go talk to their board as well.
Well, maybe once we visit with Springfield, we may have a better idea as to what questions we want to ask them as well.
Absolutely.
I'm just thinking about that. So what about Columbia? I'm trying to recall how Columbia is structured, and I don't remember.
So I think Columbia has a hybrid board type model as
I mean,
well.
that they're,
So they have certain things that go to council, but they have a utility board that they report to as well.
they're similar size to us as well. So, and they would be, I think, pretty heavy on the residential side of things as well with the university there. So I don't know. That might be another conversation we want to have.
Certainly.
Well, Mr. City Manager, to kind of wrap up just a little bit, and if anyone else have any comments, please jump in. Sounds like our next action steps are going to be try to set something up with the Springfield Utility Board and tour. And I'm throwing out like June 9th for the next meeting as just a placeholder. I mean, we can certainly change that around sooner or later, given I think we probably want to meet with Springfield first before we meet again. Kind of the consensus for those who can, or however we set that up.
I think that's great. And then let me ask if this would be helpful to the council. What if this team at this end of the table drafted what maybe a charter language would look like relative to scope of the board, size of the board, term limits, the key skill sets, the powers and duties, not to guide your conversation, but to give you something to react to, just to, I like that, I don't like that, and start to tease through that conversation for your June 9th meeting?
I think that would be a good placeholder, and as we discussed throughout that time period, you can probably tweak. Yes, Councilman.
Could we think about the 16th instead? I'm at the National Association
Sure.
of Counties. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one thought relative to the language. You know, we heard a lot of last time we did charter changes, we heard a lot of discussion about the making it simple to understand versus what we had, and I got a lot of feedback from the community relative to that. So let's keep an eye on not making it as legalistic and you know, taking a look at that at some simple to understand language. So.
I agree. I believe that our Charter Review Commission did some really good work, particularly in this area. I think we would be refining specifically more of that Article 3 section relative to the utilities and the Public Utility Advisory Board. And then, you know, this would be a very direct question that would hopefully then be written in such a way that's easier to explain. We're going from this to that.
Sounds great. Any other questions, comments? Councilwoman Wiley from afar?
I'm good. This was a really good discussion and a super important topic for this city.
I agree. Well, with
Just want to say that I really appreciate Heather spending the time to come up and be here with us, and I think it's been extremely helpful. And so, just want to say that.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. This is the fun stuff.
certainly the fun stuff to roll up your sleeves and go to work for sure. Well, thank you, everyone. But then we will call this meeting adjourned.